Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Dulce Guzmán, directora
Hello, my
ejecutiva de
name is
Alianza
Dulce
Américas. Les damos
Guzman,
la
Executive
bienvenida
Director
a
of
este
Alianza
webinar
Americas. We
que
welcome you
conforma
to
una serie
this
de cuatro
webinar that
conversaciones que
is the
buscan
very first
ofrecer
of
una
four
comprensión
conversations that
profunda
offers
y
a deep
matizada de la realidad venezolana.
conversation regarding the
Para esta
Venezuelan
serie de
reality.
webinars
For this
contamos
series
con
of webinars,
interpretación
we have
simultánea al inglés.
simultaneous
Siéntanse
interpretation
libres de
to
enviar
English,
sus
so
preguntas tanto en
feel
español
free to
como en
send your
inglés para
questions to
participar
English and
activamente en esta
Spanish in order to
conversación.
actively
For
participate in
this
this
webinar series,
conversation.
we have simultaneous interpretation into English. Feel free to send your questions either in Spanish or English, whichever language you feel most comfortable with, to actively participate in the conversation. Hoy comenzamos este espacio honrando la vida y el
Today,
legado
we
del
begin this
reverendo
space
Jesse
honoring the
Jackson,
legacy
quien ha
and life of
fallecido esta
Reverend
mañana.
Jesse Jackson,
Fue un
who
defensor
passed away this
incansable de
morning.
los
He
derechos civiles, la
was
justicia
an
económica y la
unequivocal
dignidad de las comunidades
defender of
negras,
human
migrantes,
civil rights of the migrant
trabajadoras.
and Black and
Y hoy
working communities.
recordamos siempre
And
que nuestras
today, we
luchas están
remember that
profundamente
our
conectadas.
struggles are deeply
Al reunirnos
connected.
en este seminario web,
By
pensemos
gathering
sobre el
in this
camino que él
webinar, we do it
ha
about
ayudado a trazar
on the
por el
path
compromiso
that
de
he
vida,
has helped
ampliando
trace with a
oportunidades,
commitment to
defendiendo la
continue
democracia
increasing
y
opportunities,
organizándonos
defending
entre comunidades para
democracy,
construir
and
un
getting
futuro más
organized as
justo e
communities to
inclusivo
build
para
a
todos.
stronger and more
Nuestro
equal
objetivo es
society for
conversar
everybody.
sobre
Our
las claves
purpose is
históricas,
to talk
políticas y
about the
económicas
historical
necesarias para
key
comprender
aspects
cómo
and necessary
Venezuela
to
pasó de
understand
ser
how
considerada
Venezuela
una de las
went
democracias
from
más
being
estables de
one of the
América
most
Latina
stable
a vivir
democracies in
una
Latin
crisis
America to
multidimensional
experience a
del impacto
multidimensional
histórico.
crisis
Esta
and a
serie también
historical
está
impact.
patrocinada por
This is
Alerta
also
Venezuela, que es
co-sponsored
una
by
iniciativa
Alerta
que proporciona
Venezuela, which is
información y
an initiative
análisis
that
con
provides
enfoque a
information
derechos, a
and
instancias
analysis with a
internacionales
focus
de
on
decisión
rights in
política,
international
basándose en datos de
instances
organizaciones
based
aliadas
on
en
data of
Venezuela,
allied
así como
organizations in
investigaciones
Venezuela,
propias.
as well as their
Muchas
own
gracias por sumarse
investigation.
hoy a esta
Thank you
conversación tan
for joining
importante.
today's very
En este
important
primer capítulo
conversation.
de la
In
democracia
this first
petrolera al
chapter of
proyecto
the
bolivariano,
oil
el historiador
crisis
venezolano
to
Miguel
the
Tinker Salas nos guiará en
Bolivarian
un recorrido
project,
histórico
he will
que
lead us
abarca
in
desde
a historical
punto
journey
fijo
regarding
de
the fixed point
1958
of
hasta la era de Maduro. La
1958 until the
conversación hoy será
Maduro era.
moderada por
Today's
Oscar Chacón,
conversation will be
cofundador
moderated
y
by
asesor
Oscar
senior de
Chacon,
estrategia de
co-founder
Alianza
and
Américas.
senior advisor
Oscar
of
colabora
Alianza
hoy.
Americas.
Muchas gracias por
Oscar, the floor is
acompañarnos.
yours. Thank you for accompanying us.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Dulce,
Thank
y
you
agradezco
very much,
nuevamente a quienes
and
están
thank you for
participando
those
en
of you
este
who are
evento.
participating in
Quiero
today's
comenzar
event.
por
I
agradecer
want
profundamente a
to
Miguel
start
por
by
estar
thanking
dispuesto
Miguel
a
for
compartir
being
su
willing to
conocimiento, su
share his
experiencia
knowledge,
con nosotros
his
y
experience with us,
hacerlo
and
francamente
to
en algo que yo
do it
casi
in
denominaría
something
muy
that I would
difícil.
almost call an
Tratar
impossible
de
mission,
resumir
trying
en pocos
to
minutos varias
summarize in a
décadas de
few
historia
minutes several
de
decades
Venezuela.
of Venezuela's
Creo de
history,
que
but
la
I
realidad
believe
nos
that
forza a tener
the
que ser lo
reality
más sintéticos y lo
forces us
más
to be
abreviados
as
posible
most
para
synthetic
poder
and most as brief as
alcanzar en
possible to
relativamente
try
poco
to
tiempo
reach in a
la
short
máxima
period of
transmisión
time
de conocimiento
the
histórico
best possible
sobre un
transmission of
país que obviamente
historical
ha
knowledge
estado
of a country that has
muy en las noticias a nivel
been
mundial
dominating
en
the
Estados
news, the
Unidos,
global
del cual
news, in
necesitamos
particular
conocer
in the
más.
United States, that we of
Miguel es
course have to
profesor
know more.
emérito de
Miguel,
Historia de
he's a
América
teacher
Latina y
of Latin
Estudios
America
Chicanos y
and
Latinos en el
Chicano and
Colegio de
Latino
Pomona en
stories
la
in
ciudad
the
de
Pomona
Claremont en el
University
sur de
in
California.
Claremont City in the southern part of
Nacido en
California. Born in
Caripito, es el nombre del lugar donde naciste en
Caripito,
Venezuela.
Venezuela. It's where
Es
you were born in
una de las
Venezuela.
voces
He
académicas
is
más
one of the
reconocidas
most
en Estados
recognized
Unidos
academic voices
sobre
in the
la
United
realidad
States
política y
on
social venezolana.
Venezuelan political and
Su
social
obra
realities.
abarca
His
libros,
work includes
volúmenes
books,
editados,
edited
ensayos centrados
volumes,
en
and
Venezuela y
essays
México.
focused on
Y
Venezuela
además
and
es
Mexico.
investigador
He
asociado
is
del
also a
Instituto Hughes
fellow at the
para
Quincy
una política de
Institute
Estado
for
responsable.
Responsible
Como
State
analista
Policy.
político es
As a
consultado
political
con frecuencia
analyst, he is
por medios
consulted
destacados
frequently
tal como el New York
by
Times, Democracy Now!,
media such
el
as New York
periódico The
Times,
Guardian,
The
por
Guardian,
mencionar algunos.
Democracy
Así es
Now,
que
just to
Miguel,
mention a few of
yo
them.
voy a tratar de
So, Miguel,
interrumpirte lo
I will
menos
try
posible,
to
porque
interrupt
yo sé que
you
la
as
tarea que te he
little as
referido
possible
es
because
enorme,
we know that the
tenemos poco
task we
tiempo.
asked of you is
Intervengo será
enormous. We have
únicamente para
little time.
pedirte
If
clarificar
I
algo que me
intervene, I'll just
parece que
ask you
quizás no
to
quedó bien
clarify
claro.
something
De
that
lo
was not
contrario,
left that
somos
clear. On the
completamente
contrary,
disponibles
we
para
are
escucharte
completely,
los
our
próximos
ears are completely open
minutos
to hear
en
during
este
the next
esfuerzo
minutes
titánico de
in
resumir
this
décadas de
titanic
historia.
effort of
Así
trying
es
to
que
summarize
bienvenido y
decades of history.
adelante.
So,
Muchas
welcome.
gracias.
Go
Buen
ahead.
día a todos y
Thank you
todas.
very much. Good morning,
Como
everybody.
mencionabas, Oscar, creo
As
que es
Oscar
una tarea
mentioned, I think it is
gigantesca
a gigantic task to summarize a century's worth of history in 20 minutes. I'll do as much as possible. And of course, anything I'm not able to do so, please, you can feel free to ask any questions. The Venezuelan history, the 20th century, is marked by the before and after the Punto Fijo Pact. That before oil, Venezuela produced cocoa and coffee, which was in 1914 and 19, and it was substituted in 1922 by oil when the English group and American groups established the Pozo Barroso twos exploits 11,000 barrels per day, leaving discovered one of the most productive oil fields in the world. It used to be in the focus that used to be on Mexico. Now they're focused on Venezuela. The companies go to Venezuela, and it has a contradictory feeling. For resident locals, it was a calamity. It would stain their homes, their cattle. It would contaminate the lake, destroy their crops. A priest even said that the foreigners had perforated all the way to hell and the country was going to sink. But on their part, the British were euphoric. And as the news would spread throughout the world, Venezuela became the new epicenter of oil, of global oil production, and hundreds of small companies invested in Venezuela. It's important to remember that oil in Venezuela turns its back on the majority of Latin America and focus on the United States and England. It has an immediate impact, and this impact had nothing to do with democracy because Venezuela was under a dictator, Juan Vicente Gomez, who led the country for 27 years and known as the Porfirio Diaz of Venezuela, the Mexican dictator. Venezuela is promoted as a great investment center. In a Los Angeles press release in 1921, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, they said that Venezuela is the closest illustration of the current utopia. There are no work conflicts. Life was the Bolshevism or high taxes were completely absent. This dictator promised the oil companies steps and would protect them from any type of work conflict. So for me, the modern idea of Venezuela as a nation, as a dynamic state, arises from its relationship with the oil companies and foreign interests. In other words, the state is formed in parallel to the oil industry. By 1928, Venezuela has become the main exporter of oil in the world, not producer, exporter. This new reality turned out to be significant not only because of the profits it would earn, but also the fact that oil represented a strategic reserve and military reserve, and essential so that the United States could start wars from there. They confirmed this reality, and in 1942, they said that oil is the stepping stone for our needs for oil production during Second World War. Venezuela was exactly what they needed for the oil reserves of the United States. By assessing the strategic importance of Latin American countries, and General Frank Andrews of the Caribbean Command, they said that he preferred to have Venezuela as its only partner among all the countries in Latin America. Venezuela is rich in oil, and this had been a hard blow to any bellic or war plans. In 1943, Venezuela ratifies a hydrocarbon law, negotiated with advisors from the U.S., and establishes earnings of over 50% and confirms that these oil companies are concessionists. They're not owners of the land. At the end of the war, Washington was very satisfied that Venezuela would operate within the orbit of the U.S. Even Fortune magazine affirmed that if there wasn't a perfect illustration of what U.S. capital could be in subdeveloped areas of the world, it would have been necessary to invent the Republic of Venezuela to serve as a model for other countries of the region. During the 50s, the oil profits transformed Venezuela, their cities, their fields, and society. During the Perez Jimenez government, it opened the doors to thousands of Europeans, Italians, Spanish, and Portuguese. In the words of the dictator, the efforts to promote these for European were perfectly calculated. It was necessary to improve our ethnic component, to improve our roots, quote unquote. Now, after the end of the 50s, it hid the existence of two Venezuelas, one that would benefit from oil and enjoy the life standards, the highest life standards of Latin America, a strong currency where middle class could buy in a Christian boutique, the only Christian door boutique. It was the only one in Sears stores, and they became in the greater consumers per capita of Scotch whiskey, 18-year-old Scotch whiskey. This invokes nostalgia among several sectors of society who confuse their individual experiences with the ones of the nation. It's important to acknowledge that they identified their existence with the experiences of the people, of the nation. The other Venezuela that was not benefiting from these sectors, there were the favelas or ranches that surrounded Caracas and Maracaibo, and they barely made a living working under the shadow of the oil industry. The U.S. public officials understood these realities, but they continued perpetuating that Venezuela was an exceptional nation. In a popular uprising, the dictator left the country in 1958. The democratic political parties that closed the gap, they reached an agreement. It was the Punto Fijo Pact that was based on three premises: to respect the results of the elections, to not recur to military to solve disputes, and to exclude the left that had played a fundamental role in overturning Perez Jimenez. It's important to understand that the left had played a fundamental role, but in order to soften the relationship with the U.S., which was very important, it was anti-communist perspective. The Punto Fijo Pact excluded the left, even the moderate left, who had played an important role. Even if they resolved their political differences, the agreement between all three parties did not address the inequalities in the country. It did not address inequalities. As a matter of fact, in 1961, a delegation from Alianza for Progreso that was visiting Venezuela, they warned that in 1961, two years after overthrowing the dictator, Venezuela is now a volcano. They just need a figure like Fidel Castro to make the country explode. Let me repeat, Venezuela is a volcano. All it needs is a figure like Fidel Castro for this country to explode. A decade later, the National Security Council of the U.S. affirmed that, and I quote, that unequal development in Venezuela has left millions of Venezuelans living in unequal poverty, and with the current system that makes it imperative for there to be a redistribution of income. In other words, the U.S. recognized that Venezuela had internal class contradiction and social contradictions. In 1964, the country experienced another oil boom, a country known as the Saudita Venezuela, the Saudi Venezuela. The oil earnings were flowing in Caracas and experimented another boom that changed the appearance of the cities. It was cheap. The popular phrase was, "It's cheap, give me 12 of them." The negotiated democracy did not solve inequalities, and it generated a system of impunity, corruption, especially between the political elite, increased, and there wasn't a president during this period that was not impacted or accused of having participated in corruption. The country did not have a foreign debt in 74. For 3 years, it had an external debt of $30 billion. In February 27th, another important point, it was during the Carlos Andrés Perez tried to impose austerity measures, and this was called, the protest showed that the Punto Fijo Pact was not sustainable. Within the context of a dramatic crisis of legitimacy of Caracaso, Hugo Chavez was elected president, democratically elected president in December of 1988. In these elections, the Chavez government faced organized opposition. One of the main points of the opposition was to consider Chavez an aberration in the context of the contemporary history of Venezuela. He was often represented as a return or going back, imposing his charm to impose his policies. It was a leader he represented as of a modern country. It revealed social and deeply racial, who were deep rooted within Venezuela. By 2005, with an increase of the price of oil, the Chavez government increased social expense through programs called missions. The purpose was to reduce poverty, and it was able to reduce it between 2003 and 2007. It went from 54% to 27% of the population. However, the government did not take into consideration the period of contraction because of this oil production. And at the same time, the Chavez government did not challenge the consumer type of society. In order to address this, imposed policies that during the 20s it controlled the consumption of the poorer sectors of society, limiting the acquisition power of many of society, and these could not satisfy their needs. Another axis of the government was promoting comunas, and they increased political participation in the measure that the communities started exercising control over their communities. Internationally speaking, Chavez promoted a multipolar world and the creation of organisms like UNASUR and CELAC, one for South America and the other one of communities of Latin American and Caribbean states, excluding the US. As the left was disappearing in Latin America, they were also disappearing in regional organisms. Chavez dies in March of 2013. Maduro is elected in April in some very disputed elections that the opposition did not recognize. In 2014, a faction of the opposition started to try to insurrect, which included protests known as the salida or exit. In 2017, 2018 promoted guarimbas, that they wanted to create a state of non-governance. The protest was produced in a moment where oil prices plummeted, and when the US, starting with Obama, imposed sanctions, they worsened the internal conditions of the country. Between 2014 and 2019, the oil profits reduced almost 90%. The loss of the GDP broke all records, surpassing 70%. There was a scarcity of basic supplies, medication, unemployment, drop in the value of the currency, and beyond sanctions, the bad administration, incompetence, corruption worsened everything. The response was clear. More than 7 million Venezuelans migrated from their country towards Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. Others crossed the Darien Gap. This exodus left a scar in society. Venezuela was not accustomed to migration. Historically, they had welcomed Europeans and people from South America. Thus, it was a dramatic and very sudden change in Venezuela. Oil showed to be a fragile basis for the national unity. With time, it intensified instead of reducing the conflict to try to control the state, because this involved control of the budget. It increased a model that increased the dependency on just one product, represented over 50% of all exports of the country. It was highly volatile and of a recurring crisis, a legacy of a lot of increase and then decrease. The country was vulnerable to sanctions from abroad. The traditional history of Venezuela ignored the instability and focuses on the periods and not of those that when they went down, 30s, 58, 66, 98, 2014 to 2019, and especially now. The oil industry, where it used to produce 3 million barrels when Chavez began, now produces about 1 million per day. Obviously, the sanctions are essential factors, but also emphasis on political loyalty and competition, and the leadership of the oil industry, the bad administration of the government, flagrant corruption. Two leaders were accused of pocketing billions of dollars, and of course, and this led to many sanctions. It's currently finding itself in a reflection point, facing dramatic challenges. Whoever has the power in Venezuela has to reestablish sovereignty. It cannot be a U.S. colony, or its where states are handled, its affairs are handled in the US. And it's a dynamic culture, a very proud people that doesn't define itself by a political conflict. The same as in other countries, there is a great consensus that in order to advance, Venezuela has to address and to reconcile with the different tensions that have been evidencing in the country since its foundation. I will stop there in order to expand on any topic you wish. But first, we want to thank you because you've done an incredible work to summarize this complex history in pretty much 15 minutes, and this has been done admirable. I think that of everything that you've said, to highlight maybe with a lot of clarity that the cosmetic history that Venezuela was this equal democracy and inclusive democracy that reigned until prior to 1958. It's a very fantastic and wild idea. We have a few minutes in case you want to expand or add that in which particular context does it become timely for this configuration of the candidacy of Hugo Chavez? When does it become ideal for Chavez to become a candidate and for him to win, something that he repeats throughout his reign? While there's a lot of many questions regarding the elections where Maduro first won, there's some question because it would be inappropriate to do it in such a legitimate way that Hugo Chavez won the first elections, but I think that many people don't understand that. So if you could add some additional elements, we would appreciate it. Those are two things that you mentioned. First of all, the concept of exceptional democracy. Why is Venezuela considered an exceptional democracy? Because there was a revolution in Cuba, and Venezuela becomes the alternative that the U.S. promotes, like to try to create an example of what Latin America should be. So even Rafael Caldera, the president, says they've created a show country, a country to promote abroad, a glass display show, and this country has external and internal aspects. Externally, the U.S. promotes it as a democratic country to follow or to imitate in Latin America, and internally, it's to solve racial and social and cultural issues. The Chavez figure surges as a product of what of the Caracazo that I mentioned before, as a social invoice because of what had happened, because of the inequality, the poverty, the racism that is not discussed much in Venezuela. And Chavez surges as a representative of that movement, and he wins the elections in '98 democratically, even if nowadays the narrative of some sectors is that all the elections of '98 onwards were questionable, which is not true. Chavez in '98 represented a multinational movement, a multi-class and multi-racial movement that imposes the idea that a new constitution would be essential, since the last one didn't include social factors. So the constitution was a central focus. They vote on the constitution in '99. There are new elections in 2020. There's a coup d'etat. There's a strikes and protests in oil production. Chavez didn't face elections. He faced very financed and organized opposition, in part by USAID and other international instances. These were fundamental. The elections that are going to be questioned are the ones from 2014 that were very disputed. Capriles says that he won, and Maduro maintains that he won. The international observers said that Maduro was right. The elections after this period are questioned. Some of them are the fundamental factor, but we cannot confuse that from the beginning. In 1998, Chavez faced multiple elections and he won them all.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I would just ask one more thing. Seeing the news coverage that has been unleashed in the US since January 3rd of this year, because of the military actions carried out by the US that leads to the extraction of Maduro and his wife, there have been several erroneous affirmations regarding the nationalization of oil. And this goes back to the decade of the 70s. If you could address a bit regarding the nationalization, and in particular, if such nationalization had an adverse impact for the foreign companies that have operated throughout the history of Venezuela in the sale of oil. That's a very important point because Trump started saying, oh, they stole oil from us, they stole the companies from us. That's not the reality. These are the exaggerations that this president is able to develop. That's why I mentioned the law of 1943. In 1943, Venezuela establishes its most comprehensive law. It's negotiated, it's established with counseling or advisory from the Roosevelt government. It establishes the famous 50-50 factor. The Americans established that the United Fruit Company wanted to establish in Guatemala as well. It was a model they took to Saudi Arabia. It was a model that incorporated the interest of the corporation and of the emerging state. In this sense, this was the 50-50 rule, even if it included reaching up to 60-40. This is the 1943 law. In 1975, Venezuela starts negotiating and discussing in the National Assembly a discussion regarding nationalization. It's worth mentioning, as I said previously, the oil companies were concessionaires. They have been given since 43 until 83 the concession of oil production. They were not the owners of the soil. As part of the Spanish colony, it still belonged to the state, not to private companies. In 65, they established the negotiations and they approved the law that takes effect in January of 76, where the companies receive compensations at 100%. They even mentioned that they were overcompensated since they had been exploiting oil since 1922 until 43, and from 43 to 76. They had already been overcompensated. It's during this compensation period. They talk about this in 2005, 2006, where in the Orinoco oil production, the government decides that any company that works in this area had to form a pact with PDVSA, where this PVSA would be the majority company. ConocoPhillips and Exxon do not agree with this, and they decide to leave the country. They sue the government. They go to international courts. They don't receive $16 billion, instead $1.6 billion. They start receiving the payment with the sanctions of 2019. These payments stop, and this is the only point in dispute so far. But these countries left the country because they decided to, because they did not agree. Thank you very much. Chevron stayed, and it's still producing nowadays. I was precisely going to mention the case about Chevron, but I give you thanks to your brief answers because this allows us to move on to the next part of this event, which is to hear the questions that the audience has sent, some even sent beforehand, before this event began. And for this, I invite Hazel Contreras, who will read the questions. So the floor is yours, Hazel. Thank you very much, and thank you, Miguel, for the information that you shared. As a matter of fact, yes, we have many questions, and some were already addressed during Miguel's presentation, but I'm sure he can dive deeper into them. The first question that we received was, what happened with Venezuela before the Chavez era, where a country was such rich in many natural resources had to depend on importing food products and other things. Since 1928, when Venezuela becomes the main exporter of petroleum, Venezuela becomes an importer of food. This is because of the bad conditions that existed in the field where families controlled the majority of the land. It was a very unproductive production. So the farmers decided to migrate not only to the oil fields, which is the magnet that attracts them, but also to the urban centers. So manual labor goes, of course, where they would receive more benefits, higher wages, and better conditions. There was there was there were unsanitary conditions, lots of cases of malaria and infections. So, of course, these people find work in these oil companies, and in the cities, they work in the service industry. So Venezuela becomes an importer of food for even basic things. Nowadays, this has changed. They say that almost 90% of what is consumed is produced locally. But at that moment, Venezuela was always an importer of food. One of the slogans that is established in the 40s is the idea of planting oil. Alberto Adriano proposes it, the idea that with petroleum that you could actually plant oil. This is the idea of diversifying and using the main exportation product in order to diversify the economy and to create the agricultural production. Another fundamental factor here, they wanted to create the production system by paying low salaries to the employees. They wanted to stay in the field earning low salaries when they could earn better salaries working in the oil industry or urban centers. So it was a vision of a extra landowner class that wanted to send the idea of planting oil, which was absorbed by oil company. It was a slogan in all their banners where they would say, "We are planting oil," when in reality they were just planting their profits. Thank you, Miguel. The next question is a question that we've seen a lot in social media, and it has to do, why did Chavez choose Maduro as his successor? This is the question that everybody asked themselves. I remember I was in Venezuela when Chavez gets sick, having Diosdado Cabello by his side and having Nicolás Maduro. He says, if something happens to me, please vote for Nicolás Maduro. It's a question that many people ask themselves. The experiences of Maduro back then, he had just been a political activist. He had been a factor in extracting Chavez from jail and had been the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. The only explanation that many of us have is that many within the international context, Maduro could be that figure that could handle international relations. He had the he had the context. It's the only experience that we have in that context. We could use another analysis point, and that's that one of the criticisms of the Chavista movement is the hyper-presidentialism. And this hyper-presidentialism, it overshadowed other figures within the social movement. I'm not saying the Chavisto, instead the social movement that Chavez was a part of, that Chavez used to lead. So we are facing a question that might not have a specific answer or a complete answer, but it's understood within the context of what I just mentioned. Thank you. Another of the questions related, how did these foreign companies be able to affect the middle class in Venezuela? I addressed this in my book, the Legacy That Lasts, which is available in Spanish and English. It's a central issue. The oil industry becomes a social library. The oil fields that produce this product, they were representation of what the middle class wanted to be. The fields were divided between sectors. The senior staff camp the junior staff camp, and the working camp, just senior class camp, where the Americans that came as knowledge bearers, the junior staff camp, where the Venezuelans, such as lawyers, public accountants, the business owners, and through which the oil industry became the fundamental factor in promoting their interests and promoting the notion of what would be citizenship, a citizenship that respected the state, respected public order, that would be anti-union, anti-progressive, and it would follow the North American model. So these oil fields are essential in order to forge an identity of what Venezuela means. This is what I meant when I say that they confuse their personal experiences with the interest of the nation. That's a confusion that they cause. It's a minority experience. You have to recognize that a minority in the Venezuela context, I know that some stories don't even reach 18, 20%. So we're talking about the creation of an opinion matrix that's social, cultural, political, uh, what would define the citizen within the Venezuelan context.
Pasamos a la siguiente pregunta
Let's
y
move on to
esa
the
tiene que
next
ver
question.
con,
This one has to do,
¿existe un
is
paralelismo
there
entre lo que
any
vivió
parallels
Venezuela durante
into
el
what
Caracazo
Venezuela experienced
y
during the
lo que hemos
Caracazo
visto en otros
and
países
what we've
sociales
seen in
latinoamericanos
other Latin American
recientes?
recent Latin American social crises? I think that the Caracazo occurs within a Latin American context. Remember that these protests were in Rosario, in Haiti, these were in Dominican Republic. In Venezuela, the context is different because the model had been different. It had created the idea, the fiction of an exceptional democracy, a democracy that was unmatched in Latin America, a democracy that was always an ally of the U.S. So within this context, when this unravels or when it collapses, when the system collapses, it faces the idea the exceptional model was false. The exception, I quote my work, I attribute my work to a famous historian that it took 3 days of the Caracazo for my vision of Venezuela to completely crumble to pieces. And within the comparing it to the Argentina or Caribbean context, in the case of the Venezuela context, it was very linked to the concept of a nation that had been created and had been so strong within the middle class.
Una pregunta que hemos recibido
Another
de las
question
personas
that
que
we
están
receive
acá
from
con
the people
nosotros,
that are
muchas
here
gracias
with
por
us,
su
and thank you
participación,
very much for your
es si había
participation,
diferencias
if there were any
significativas entre
significant
partidos
differences
políticos
between
antes
the
del
political
chavismo.
parties prior to the Chavismo. There were few differences. We're talking about three political parties. Acción Democrática, a party that is able to initially incorporate, since it was part of the resistance against dictatorship, incorporates left-leaning people, people from the communist and socialist parties. But that little by little, in order to reach power, they were removing, extracting people, or expelling people. We're talking about Acción Democrática with their leader, better known as Pepo Betancourt, prior to Rómulo Gallegos. We're talking about Rafael Cardera and the Partido Cristiano Demócrata, which was a bit more conservative than the Social Demócrata, and another party, URB, the Jorge Villalma, which also shared a lot of the vision with Acción Democrática. They proposed very few differences. They all agreed on the importance of the U.S., on the importance of a policy that would offer itself as an ally of the U.S. within the context of what the presidency and the political party and the political positions, they all recognize the importance of the unions, but they didn't go beyond this to speak in detail about poverty and inequality and racism. So there was an artificial narrative of what Venezuela really was within this context in which it didn't incorporate these other sectors.
Gracias.
Thank
Y
you.
la siguiente pregunta,
And
que
the
ya es
next
las últimas que vamos a
question,
poder cubrir,
which
porque
is
sí
one of the
tenemos
last ones
bastantes,
we
pero
will
el
have
tiempo
to
se nos
cover
está
because
yendo,
we have many of
es
them and time is running up.
Venezuela
Venezuela was a founding member of the countries of OPEC. How did this position influence the country's foreign policy and its relationship with the United States? That's a great question, because how is it that a country that was such a big ally of the US goes to the Middle East, establishes relationship with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other Gulf countries, and they establish what becomes OPEC, the Organization of Oil Producers? It's a very big doubt, question that we have, because Venezuela, since the 50s, started acknowledging it was losing its privileged role as the main exporter of oil to the US and for Europe. So it acknowledged that because of the international oil companies, it was always easier to put one country in competition with another. It reminds me of a phrase from Barron's magazine saying that Venezuela is about to become a gas station for the US and nothing else. They acknowledged that this competition that was developing between Arab countries and Venezuela and other countries in the region would lead to a reduction in the prices of oil, to a reduction in their earnings or profits, which was very important because this rentist model was essential to maintain the negotiated democracy, because these resources allowed the clients to depend on them, allowed other factors. Thus, they established OPEC. The Americans, without realizing, they contribute to this, because if you imagine this, Venezuela, if they go to the Middle East, who's going to represent them? The American companies made the introductions in such a way. So this becomes an important factor because of the oil embargo, because of the Gulf War, the very first Gulf War, the one in the 70s. So I think in that sense, OPEC is essential, even when it has a contradictory positioning. We're going to move on to the last question. What are the challenges and criticisms to the Venezuelan democracy, especially with regards to transparency and accountability? But what aspect, when you say the oil democracy, do you mean the period before Chavez or the period during Chavez? I would say that in both, the lack of transparency was a big factor. The idea that to close ranks in order to protect the system, whether with either governments prior to Chavez or the Chavismo itself, were fundamental factors that they weren't able to establish a real transparency. Like in the case of Brazil, where, for example, the budget was a public thing. Some of them would even allege that within this context, it wasn't carried out because it was such big and permanent impacts, and they would use the information to attack the government. In any case, I prefer transparency, and that is essential. I think that for any process, any movement, transparency must be essential. I agree. And now moving on to the final question, which it's a question that we see repeated in other spaces or social media in conversations after January 3rd of 2026. How can the Venezuelan people, the ones that are still in Venezuela, how can they benefit from the current situation? That is complicated because we are facing a sponsored transition. Venezuela is what Cuba used to be in 1902, where decisions are taken in Miami or even worse in Washington or even worse in Miami, and they receive the things that must be implemented. So this means that any person or any movement within the government of Venezuela first has to recover national sovereignty. The decisions cannot take place abroad because foreign interests are not the same as the national interests. So Venezuela has to deal with inequality and poverty, which has been on the rise again. There has to be reconciliation with the different perspectives that exist in the country. How to do it based on what? The Constitution of 99, the Constitution from back then, where there was a census during that process. I think it's fundamental to recover sovereignty we propose the consensus and reestablish the Venezuelan Republic.
Muchísimas gracias, Miguel. Vamos a
Thank you very
cerrar la
much,
parte
Miguel.
de las
We're going
preguntas de
to
la audiencia.
finalize the section
Seguramente
of
dejan
questions
más
from the audience,
preguntas
which I'm
para el
sure that the
futuro,
audience
así
has
que le
many
doy
more
la
questions for
palabra
the
a
future.
Oscar.
So I'm going to
Gracias,
open the floor
Hazel.
to
Bueno,
Oscar. Thank you,
reitero
Hazel.
nuestros
I
agradecimientos, Miguel,
reiterate
por tan
our
importante
appreciation and
contribución
gratitude,
a
Miguel,
que se
for your
entienda
such a
mejor
wonderful
el
contribution
contexto
to,
histórico
in order to
que
better
nos llevó
understand the historical
precisamente a
context
la realidad
that
de Venezuela de
took
los
that
últimos
led us to
20
the
años
reality
en
of
un momento
Venezuela
tan
during the
crítico
last 20
en el que
plus years
Venezuela entraba
and
a partir del
the
3 de
very
enero de este
crucial
año.
moment that Venezuela
Yo
finds itself
quizás
starting
nada
in
más te
January 3rd.
pediría
I would
para
just
finalizar
simply
si
ask
puedes
to
listar al menos
finalize if you could
el
list
mejor libro que
at
tú le
the very
recomendarías a
least
la
the
gente leer de
best
tu
book that you
propia
would
autoría,
recommend people to
o si
read,
quieres
books of
también
your own
recomendar
that
otro
you have
recurso
written,
que
or
nos
if you want to
ayude a
recommend
profundizar
another
más sobre
resource
muchos de los
that
temas
would
tocados.
allow
Creo
us
que nos
to
ayudaría
learn more
mucho
about
porque,
these
como dije al
topics you
comienzo,
mentioned. I think
es
it would
una
help
tarea
us
casi
because,
imposible
as I
resumir
mentioned
una
before,
historia tan
it's almost
compleja,
impossible to
tan
summarize
distante de
such
las
a complex
narrativas
history,
dominantes que
such
tienden
so distant
a
from the
hacer eco
narratives
en los
that
medios de
tend to
comunicación, y eso creo
be
que nos
repeated
ayudaría.
in the media outlets. I think that would help us. Well, if you want to understand deep oil in a deeper sense, the enduring legacy, there was policy, society, and culture of Venezuela. It's available in Spanish and English. If you want a general book about the history of Venezuela, there's this book called Venezuela, What Everybody Needs to Know. It gives a brief roadmap of the history of Venezuela, starting from the indigenous groups until 2015 or 2020, because I couldn't incorporate the most recent events. But yes, both of my books are available, and I appreciate any
Excelente.
question.
Muchísimas
Thank you
gracias.
very much.
Pues mira,
Thank you.
queremos
Well,
reiterar pues, el
we want to
agradecimiento por tu
reiterate
generosidad.
our
Lo que hemos
appreciation for your
escuchado
generosity,
nos
and what we've
permite
heard
comprender
allows us
mejor,
to
con
better
mayor profundidad,
understand
las
and with
raíces
better
históricas de una
detail the
crisis que
historical
llevó
roots of a
a que
crisis
millones de
that
personas,
led to
algunos
millions of
afirman 7,
people,
8, 9, 10
some
millones de
claim
personas
up
que han
between
salido
7,
de
10 million
Venezuela a lo
people
largo de los
who have
últimos
left
10, 12 años,
Venezuela during
que
the
por
last
cierto la
10,
mayoría
12 years.
quedándose en
As a
el
matter of
contexto
fact, the
regional
majority
de
of
Colombia
them
en
have
particular,
stayed in
y
the
creo que
regional
también nos
context,
ayuda a
Colombia in
entender el
particular,
rol
and it helps
en
us
muchos sentidos
understand
perverso que el
the
petróleo ha
role, the
jugado
perverse
en la
role that
vida de la
oil has
persona
played
venezolana
in
común y
the life
corriente,
of the
que creo
Venezuelan,
que al
the
final de
common
cuentas sigue
Venezuelan
siendo como el más
citizen.
grande
And at the
desafío
end of
para
the
las
day, it's
sociedades
still the biggest
latinoamericanas y el
challenge
resto
for
del
Latin
mundo,
American
y es cómo
societies and the rest of
encontrar
the
una
world. And
formulación
it's
de
how to
política
find a
económica de
formulation of
gobernanza, una
governance and
política de
political
bienestar
economy,
social que haga que la
a
gente
policy
realmente
of
viva
social
mejores
well-being
vidas
that
de las que hasta
allows
ahora
people to
hemos podido
lead better
vivir,
lives compared to the
incluso
ones that
vidas
we
que
lived
hagan que
before.
la migración
Even lives
deje de
that
ser una
cause
opción tan
migration
poderosa
to stop
para
being
mucha
such a
gente.
powerful or
Les
attractive
invitamos
option for
también a
people.
acompañarnos en
We
los
invite you
capítulos
to
restantes de esta
accompany
serie
us
que
for the
seguirá ofreciendo
remaining
claves fundamentales para
chapters or
entender
sessions for
la
this
Venezuela de
series
hoy
to
y
understand
sus
Venezuela
repercusiones en toda
nowadays
la
and
región.
its
Desde
repercussions throughout the
Alianza
region.
Américas
On
y
behalf of
Alerta
Alianza
Venezuela,
Americas
les
and Alerta
agradecemos
Venezuela,
por
we thank you
acompañarnos en este
for
primer capítulo
accompanying us
y
in this first
esperamos que se
chapter,
registren
and
para
we
las
hope that you
sesiones
sign up
que vienen, que van
for
a
the coming
completar
sessions, which
toda la
will
información que hasta ahora
complete
hemos
all the
aprendido
information
gracias
that
a la
we've
capacidad de
learned,
síntesis de
thanks
Miguel,
to the capacity that Miguel
ofreciéndonos un
has had to
panorama en
summarize,
tiempo récord, en
offering in
tiempos
record
precedentes,
time and
de una historia
unprecedented
compleja.
time a very
Así es que
complex
yo de
history.
mi parte
So,
no tengo
on
más que
my part,
añadir.
I have
Hazel, no
nothing
sé si
left
algo dejé
to
fuera
add.
que quieras
Hey, so I don't know if I left
corregir,
something
o si
out,
tienes
something you
algún
want me,
comentario final,
something you want
Miguel,
to
también que
correct,
ofrecer.
or if you have a final comment you want to offer. I would just say that when the Spanish arrived in Venezuela and they asked the indigenous, what is that black thing coming from the land? They said, it's the devil's poop or devil's
Sí,
excrement.
creo que sí. Muy
I think
revelador.
it's very revealing.
Sí,
Yes, that is very revealing.
respalda pues
And
algo que dije que
it backs up something
lamentablemente
that I said that
el petróleo, como bien
unfortunately,
sabemos,
oil,
no
as
es
you
el futuro.
know,
El
is not the
petróleo
future.
tan
Oil
consumido
is
y tan promovido, particularmente por
it's
el gobierno
consumed
actual
and
en
promoted
Estados
so
Unidos,
much by
es
the
realmente
current
un
US
veneno
government.
no solamente
It's
para los
really
seres
is
humanos,
a
sino un
poison not only
veneno
for human beings but
de
also
capacidad tóxica enorme
for
para el
the
planeta
its
en el que
toxic
vivimos.
capacity
Y en
for
la
the
medida
planet
que
in
no
which we
seamos
live in.
capaces de encontrar
And
alternativas
as
al
long as we aren't
extractivismo
capable of
petrolero y de
finding
otros productos
alternatives
naturales,
to oil
no vamos
extraction,
realmente a
we
encontrar
won't
las respuestas
truly
que la
find that
humanidad
answer,
más
that
necesita
the
para
answer that
asegurar un
humanity
futuro
truly
digno
needs to
para la mayoría de
ensure
las
a
personas
dignified
a lo
future
largo
for
y
the
ancho del
majority of
globo
people
terrestre.
throughout the world.
¿Algo más, Miguel?
I agree. Anything else, Miguel? No, I agree.
Hazel, ¿algo más?
Excellent. Hazel, something else?
Solamente muchas gracias
No, just thank
bueno,
you very
Oscar, por la
much,
moderación y
Oscar,
por estar
for
aquí
your
con los
moderation,
comentarios
for being
pertinentes.
here with
Y a
us
Miguel
with
por
your very
todo lo que ha
relevant
compartido con
comments. And
nosotros.
thanks to
Reitero,
Miguel
esta es
for
la
everything
primera
he
sesión que
shared.
quedará
I
también
reiterate, this
disponible
is the
en
very
inglés
first
y en
session that will
español
be made
en nuestro
left
canal de
available in
YouTube
Spanish
y
and English
también
in our YouTube
vendrán otras
channels.
sesiones. Así que
And new
les invitamos
sessions
a estar
will
pendientes de
also be on
nuestras
the
redes
way. So we
sociales
invite
y
you to
muchas
pay
gracias
attention to
a
our
todas y
social
todos.
media. And thanks to everybody. Thanks to you as well for
Absolutamente.
Gracias,
organizing
Y
Miguel.
this.
hemos terminado en
Definitely.
tiempo
We
también récord.
finished in record
Estamos
time as
todavía con
well.
10
We still
minutos
have
que lo
10
vamos a
minutes
dar para
left
que los
that we
aprovechen,
will
reflexionen y
allow
lean y
for you
compren los
to
libros de
reflect,
Miguel
to
que
go
van a
and
ayudarles a
purchase
entender
Miguel's book,
mejor
which will
la
help you
historia de
better
Venezuela y en
understand the
particular
history
el
of
rol tan
Venezuela, and in
determinante que, como
particular,
Miguel
the
señalaba,
such a
ha jugado
determining
el
role that,
petróleo
as Miguel
en la
has
historia de
mentioned, the
Venezuela.
role that Venezuela
Así que
has, the oil
muchísimas
has
gracias
played in
por
the
haber
history of
estado con
Venezuela.
nosotros. Es
Thank you
un
very much
placer
for
estar
having
en
been here
compañía de
with us.
ustedes.
It is a pleasure to
Gracias,
be
Miguel.
here in company with all of you.
Ok, gracias
Thank
a
you very
ustedes,
much.
gracias
No,
Hazel, gracias
thanks
Oscar.
all of you.
Por
Thank you,
supuesto.
Hazel. Thank you, Oscar. Of course.